Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So this is going to be the first of two parts in this Moscow Sicilian video on the third move knight d7, and this is going to be the third and final system we look at. So after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop b5 check, we're going to be looking at the most combative option, knight d7. Now the thing with this move is that there's a lot more theory than in bishop d7 or knight c6, like so much more. And so we're going to be looking at all of the various options, but I decided to separate this this coverage of the third move knight d7 into two parts. In the second part, we're going to be looking at the move d4 here, because this leads to completely different types of play, and so I really wanted to just separate this move from the other moves. So after d4, for example, c takes d4 and queen takes d4, this is the main line of this variation, and black needs to know what they're doing because this pin is quite annoying and the queen is already centralized. So ideas of knight gf6 and be met with like bishop g5 and possible captures on f6, so things like that. And so this leads to completely different types of play, and so we're going to be looking at all of the other moves from this position, and we're going to be looking at the complications that could arise. So the basic idea behind this move, bishop b5 and knight d7, is that white is arguing that white could either play c3 and d4 really quickly to get a good center, but black has enough resources in general to counter that. Or they can play for a c4 setup and achieve the Maroczy bind. And so oftentimes players will, against bishop d7, they can often choose like the Maroczy bind setup, and against knight d7 they can also choose Maroczy bind setup with the immediate c4 or castling and then playing c4. Those kinds of positions. And the knight on d7 is kind of misplaced, but it's not on c6 where it's really annoying, for there to be a pin, because we can simply recapture on d7 with the bishop after we play a move like a6. And white has many ideas of, for example, if we play a6, white may want to play a4, a5 to clamp down on the queen side. Or, they can either try to mainly play on the center. And most of the time I think c3 and d4 is the typical way to go. So, that's just a preview of like the possible lines that we will be looking at. So we're going to be looking at this move knight c3. This is less flexible than a move like castling, because this virtually shows what white wants to accomplish with the setup. And it might be better just psychologically to allow more options of like castles, let's say. And so here, the typical move we want to play to break the pin is a6. And so after, if they retreat, then we just continue with knight f6, possible g6 and bishop g7. That's the kind of setup we can go for. And after bishop takes d7, and bishop takes d7 and d4, c takes d4, queen d4, and a move like rook c8 here, this can transpose to actually the third move, or rather, I think the fourth move, d4. So after, for example, castles, e5, queen d3, h6, this transposes to a Nepo versus Giri game that we will be looking at in a bit, or in the next video, actually. So for example, we could reach that position from d4, takes, a6, bishop d7, bishop takes d7, let's just say knight c3, e5, queen d3, rook c8, castles, h6. So we could be looking at that system from this position. So that's one of the moves for move knight c3. Instead, bishop a4 is a relatively new line. It usually transposes to the other lines, but the idea is to step out of a6 in advance. And so seeing that a6 does nothing in this position right now, we can just continue developing with knight f6. The idea is additionally to play c4 and keep this pin and just set up a Maroczy bind. And after knight f6, castles. Here, taking the pawn is not really wise because this is a very well-known line that gives white a lot of competition after rook e1, knight f6, and d4. For example, takes, and it's really hard to develop here because e6 can be met with knight f5, or I think e6 with knight b5 actually. And the take on d6 here, and so it's really hard to develop here. Not recommended. Instead of taking the pawn, e6 is best. And the rule of thumb here is that if white has the option of playing c3 and d4 in one go, we normally go for the e6 setup because if we play g6 setup, we're just not fast enough to contest the center. Let's say after rook e1, bishop g7, c3, castles, and d4. If we ever take on d4, then white has access for the knight on c3, and they accomplish the c3 and d4 in one go. And so the g6 setup is not effective in dealing with that because we don't have a typical central, challenge. We can't challenge the center in with a move like d5 or e5. And so here, after e6, white can play a setup with c4, but this now really just sacrifices e4 pawn. And since white is just one step closer, black is one step closer to castling after playing the move e6, I think it's good to take here. And after rook e1, let's say the knight retreats to f6, d4 opening up the center. Instead of taking on d4, which could allow a lot of complications after takes, bishop e7, and this really crazy move rook takes e6, played by Eric Hansen against Ivan Saric, this can get really messy, and it's still equal. So I don't recommend going to this. Instead, the simple move bishop e7 is just really nice, and this just keeps the extra pawn, because if they ever push d5, then I think e5 here is a very reasonable option, or e takes d5 also is good. Yeah, e takes d5 I think is best, followed by castles here, and we're just up a pawn. So there's no, there's not enough compensation here with the bishop also stranded on e4. So instead of that, d takes e5 is relatively best, but after dc5, bishop f4, castles, and knight c3, white has compensation because black is lagging in development. But after the next move, knight b6, this really highlights the awkward situation of white's bishop, because we're attacking the c4 pawn and the bishop as well, forcing the bishop to retreat to b3, after which we can simply trade off the pieces, rook a d1, and then play the move bishop d7. And after black plays the move rook f d8, they can retreat with the bishop to e8 and just focus on trying to exchange more pieces. And white has no compensation because now, after we exchange a lot of pieces, this bishop is again just bad on b3. And so this is just up a pawn. So instead, c4 can't be played here, and rook e1 is best just to defend the pawn. And now we will play the move a6. So now we're actually threatening to trap the bishop with b5 and c4. And so white has two options here. They can go for the Maroczy bind, which is not ideal because white has wasted a tempo on rook e1, and the bishop is offside on a4. And so here, after bishop e7, knight c3, castles, and d4, white gets a Maroczy structure, but the bishop is kind of awkward on a4 here. So cd4, knight d4 is possible. Instead of queen takes d4 also, and then we can play queen c7 with b6, bishop e7, and then bring a rook to c8, signifying that, or exemplifying that the bishop on a4 is actually not really useful. So that gives good counterplay. Instead, if knight takes d4, now queen c7, again, typical move, attacking the c4 pawn. After queen e2, knight e5. Now this forces the bishop to retreat to b3, because b3 can be met with b5. And there's a hanging knight on c3 here, and the bishop on a4 is also trapped. So instead of that, bishop b3, and now rook e8. So this is a nice move. We see that with the knight on e5, it's actually quite vulnerable to f4. And so this does nicely force the bishop to retreat back. And so we need to defend the center and influence the center with a move like rook e8. After f4 and knight g6, now black is ready to push e5 if allowed, or simply develop with a healthy hedgehog structure with b6 and bishop b7. So this is quite a nice position. Yeah, so keep one. Instead of this system, I believe with bishop a4, we can look at the next system, which is the move c4, setting up a Maroczy bind. But this move is really committal, and it shows that white has no prospects of playing the move c3 d4, right? And since the pawn structure is already determined, black can either choose this, decide to choose an e6 or g6 setup, depending on the structure. And after knight f6, it's always useful to attack the e4 pawn, knight c3. Black again has the dilemma here of playing g6 or e6. And because this is a Maroczy bind, it's very commonly known that a g6 setup is the best way to play against it. A move like e6 here would just weaken the d6 pawn a lot, and it would kind of justify this pin. Because there's a lot of pressure on this knight on d7 here. After castles, bishop e7, d4, cd4, knight d4, castles, and bishop a4, a nice move preparing a knight jump to b5. Black can play a6 here, covering the b5 square, queen e2, queen c7. A position like this, king h1, knight e5, forcing the bishop back. And after knight c6 here, white has an edge because I don't see a comfortable way to deal with this bind, as black is not achieving the b5 or d5 break anytime soon, though it's still kind of playable. A move like b6 here, it's possible, very possible. And even continuing with the hedgehog setup doesn't seem that bad to me also. Although the computer doesn't prefer this. And I think just the rule of thumb of as I said before, if white cannot play c3, d4 immediately, in one go, and chooses a move like c4, we see that c3 and d4 is no longer possible. And so a g6 setup going for a dragon is very nice here. And we're just ignoring this pin completely. White can play d4 immediately, which would, which could possibly transpose to the to castling. And it's useful here to know the basic ideas of generating counterplay in the Maroczy bind structure. For example, a move like a6 b5 here, even if it seems like impossible a lot of the times. Or recognizing that this bishop on b5 can be stranded a lot of the times. So for example, c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop g7, castles. There is a threat here of playing knight b6 followed by a6, which should force the bishop to retreat back to b3. And so here best is for white just to give up the bishop. This has been played by Grishik against Shankland recently. After bishop takes g7, the bishop is actually quite useful on d7 here because it supports a possible a6 b5. And b3 is possible here to support the c4 pawn, but this concretely allows black to generate queenside counterplay here with a6, preparing b5 next. And after a move like a4, it looks like it solves b5, but notice how the long diagonal is weak, and so black can get away with playing b5 here. Notably, because after the mass exchanges, for example, the rook takes on a8 and queen takes on a8, there will be a lot of pressure on e4. So this is a very common idea in this variation, that the queen on a8 can actually recapture and put some pressure on e4. After ab5, for example, a sample line like this is clearly nothing. Black has no problems with the rook coming to c8 and having an active bishop on g7. Instead, queen d3 is an interesting move to try to prevent any a6 b5 counterplay and defending e4. And still a6, preventing the use of a piece on b5. h3, white should watch out for this knight g4 to e5 maneuver. We should target e5 and prepare like a move like rook c8, and if white plays b3, then b5. We can see that the knight on c3 can be hanging in a lot of the lines. And so rook c8 here. And now we're threatening queen c7, and again, b3 can be met with b5. And if they play b3 now, then now b5 is very nice because there are a lot of loose pieces on the c file, the knight here, and also along the diagonal. So after c b5 and a b5, the pawn can't be captured here because tactical sequences of knight takes e4. And so black will play queen b6 and possibly b4 next with a comfortable and active position. And instead of b3, a4 is possible, trying to prevent b5 here. And instead of and seeing that we can't exactly accomplish b5 in this position, we should switch to the typical plan of playing for the d5 break. This is a very common idea that once white stops the b5 advance, we just continue with the other break. b3, necessary move to consolidate the structure, but then here we strike with d5, which is a temporary pawn sacrifice before white is able to complete development. Like if they play bishop e3 and rook d1, then I think white is just significantly better. But now d5 is just in time. After cd5, we have this strong move queen c7, an intermezzo. And if they take on e6 here, we can just take on c3. Takes. If they take the bishop, then now we can recapture. And one of the pawns on b3 or e4 are going to fall with the knight c5 coming next. And this bishop is just really powerful in this diagonal. So this is very nice for black. Instead, if they play bishop e2, now after e takes on d5, if they play knight takes d5, we can just take, and I play queen c5 here, winning back the pawn and making use of this pin. Instead, if they play e takes d5, now queen c5 again threatens to win back the pawn. After knight d2, we have this nice move queen b6. attacking b3, another weak pawn, and white can't protect everything. For example, queen c2 here, knight takes d5, leads to mass exchanges with the c file here. Takes, bishop takes here, takes, for example, bishop g7, and after knight takes h7 here, the knight is, this knight is attacked, and so is this knight. Knight takes h7, rook takes e2. We have objective equality here, because, yeah, firstly, these pawns are symmetrical, the pawn structure is symmetrical, but this pawn on b3 can be weak with rook b2 coming next. Black has a strong bishop on this diagonal, and this knight, needs a lot of moves to get back in the game. So I do like this position for black, just a slight advantage. So yeah, this covers this this Maroczy bind kind of way to play. Instead, if they play castles immediately, bishop g7, white can try to not play the move d4 here and play this move bishop a4, which was played by Eltaj against Nishigiri in 2016. And after castles, d3 is possible here, but I think a comfortable setup is just playing b6. And I don't really see a purpose to playing d3 here with bishop b7 coming next. This is quite a comfortable position. D4 is played once, but I don't really see the point of this. I guess the point of it could be that the c6 square is kind of weakened, so after we take on d4, knight takes d4, there's a possibility of the bishop and knight entering on c6. But after bishop b7, playing knight c6 immediately is just really dubious because we get a lot of tempi. Bishop b5, knight c5, attacking this pawn, f3 and knight fd7, and black has a lot of control over the dark squares, and with great coordination. Instead of knight c6 immediately, f3 is possible, but again, after rook c8, the bishop on a4 is really just stranded. Black can play a6 here to prevent a use of the b5 square, or just advance with e6 d5. And black has good pressure on the c file, and a nice long-term bishop on this diagonal. So yeah, that's quite a nice position. Instead, h3 is possible. This was played by Eltaj Safarli. But after knight b6, now again, this forces the bishop to an awkward position because it needs to defend the c4 pawn. So after bishop b3, now in this structure, it's nice to actually fix the pawns. Because we see that white has not played the move d4, now we just prevent it completely. And in this structure, we need to be careful of playing a move like e5, because if this diagonal does not open up, let's say after we move the knight away and play f5, if this diagonal doesn't open up, then this bishop will be a bad bishop long term. But in this specific scenario, notice how white's pieces aren't coordinated, especially with this bishop on b3. This bishop is just out of the action and just defending a pawn on c4. And so with this in mind, I think that this position is very playable. Black can continue with a move like knight e8 and f5 and try to create an attack. From a human perspective, this looks like a more comfortable position. And one notable thing about the structure is that typically we need to be careful about playing a structure like this, like a Botvinnik kind of setup here, because it might be vulnerable to c3 d4. But seeing that the pawn has advanced to c4, this is no longer possible to break up the center. So this is quite a nice position. After, let's say, d3, we're going to be following this game by Giri. Knight e8 here prepares both f5 and also the knight to reroute to e6. Sorry about these arrows. Via c7. And after bishop g5, f6, bishop e3, f5 was played, and black is already more comfortable here with clear kingside play, intending to play f4, h5, g5, and then etc. with a crushing attack. So yeah, that's kind of the position that we can get if white delays the move d4 in this line with the fourth move c4. Instead, let's look at another move, a4. So the idea of a4 here is to slow down black's typical counterplay of playing a6, b5, and has ideas that after we play a6, white can also possibly play a5 to clamp down the queen side. But we have some very nice resources in this line. So after knight f6 here, attacking the pawn, knight c3, and now g6. Again, the rule of thumb is if c3, d4 cannot be played in one go, for example, because they play a move like d3, which would slow the plan of c3, d4, because you need another tempo, or especially this move knight c3, which now blocks the c-pawn, we can go for this g6 setup, and it's quite comfortable. After a5, which has been played by Carlsen in the past a couple of times. Yeah, castles doesn't change much. a5 is typically the plan that white goes for. Bishop g7, castles, and now a6. So it's important here that after white castles, we play a6 now, because we don't want to allow white to play rook e1 and bishop f1. So playing a6 now is just very nicely timed. As I mentioned in the previous video, if white typically gets to move rook e1 and bishop f1 to coordinate their pieces, they're typically doing quite well. And so a6 here is very important. Now, if they give up the bishop here with bishop takes d7, after knight takes d7, black gets good counterplay here with a b5 advance next. For example, rook e1, a very common idea is after b5, a takes b6, this interesting move bishop e7. So not, hurrying with knight takes b6, because the possibility of queen takes b6 might come. If, let's say, white plays d3 and bishop e3, queen takes b6 is a legitimate option to put pressure. And so instead of that, bishop e2 is the main move. Just retreating the bishop, not blocking the d-pawn. And after castles, white can play the move d3 here. It doesn't really change much, because this leads to a close Sicilian position after b5 take, and then again bishop e7, knight d2. We're following a Robson versus Shanklin game from the 2021 US Championships, and now here black can continue with queen c7, looking to improve the knight from f6 to d7 to b8, and then finally to c6 to control the central square. And sometimes, like if the knight comes to b3 and then a5, it's possible to actually just give up this bishop, because the knight has spent so much time going to f3 to d2 to b3 to a5 only to capture the bishop. So it's very reasonable to allow that that captures, and black should be fine there. Although white did in that game manage to gain a slight advantage, but did not manage to convert it. Instead, rook e1 here. So the rook can be useful on the f file to prepare f4. So I don't think that rook e1 is a particularly great move. And here b5 again, typical move. A takes b6, and now bishop b7. Again, not rushing to take back the pawn, keeping the options open. And after d3 here, queen takes b6 and knight takes b6 are the most common options. But Grishuk actually played this move a5, an improvement, when he played this against Xiong. And here the idea is that black keeps the option of queen takes b6 and knight takes b6 still alive, while having the idea of a4 here, a5, a4, showing that, or claiming that this b2 pawn is weaker than this a5 pawn, because there's going to be pressure on the queen side here. For example, bishop e3, now queen takes b6. We see where queen takes b6 is actually useful, targeting b2, rook a2, and now here bishop c6 is a nice improvement over the game, with various ideas of pressuring the b file, queen b7 here to play across a long diagonal with quite a nice position. And it's, so we covered this move, bishop e2. So that's the fourth move, a4. And the next move we can look at is c3. Very principled, white wants to play the move d4. And after knight f6, white has various options here. If they play a move like d3 here, which is very passive and unambitious, I think black gets a very nice game here. After a6, forcing the bishop back to a4, b5, bishop c2, bishop b7. Black can continue with g6 and bishop g7 next, with a very easy game and two active bishops. White does not control the center, and black has a very good score in these kinds of positions. Again, we see that once white plays d3, they cannot go for this quick c3, d4 plan. And so the setup with g6 and bishop g7 is perfectly timed to counter this setup. Instead of d3, if they play them with bishop d3, which is an interesting option and relatively new move. This was popular back in 2019 to 2020. The idea is to prophylactically drop the bishop back to c2 and then continue with d4 next, because the bishop often lands on c2 anyways, from a4 to c2. But in this situation, they're not running into a6, b5, with tempo. And so here, I do like the setup with g6, because white played another move that actually made this entire maneuver of bishop d3 that made this c3 d4 plan one move slower, or a couple moves slower, because they're moving the bishop in front of the pawn. And so I do like this move g6. After castles, bishop g7, white can play the immediate bishop c2, but now here b5 is very nice. So yeah, b5 is nice. Castling here is possible, but it leads to different kinds of play because white can play a4 here and prevent the b5 advance. And so b5 here is actually the main move and what is considered best. And now if white plays a move like a4, we can play b4 here with pressure on the queen side with a good game. If they play rook e1, which is logical to get this move first before playing d4, we can play bishop e7, d4, and castles. So in general, if black wants to get the if black gets to fianchetto the bishop to g7 in such a position, and the e5 advance doesn't bring white a lot, then black should be quite happy. White does have a strong pawn center, but we always have the idea of going for a closed Spanish structure with a timely e5 advance. And our pieces are on ideal squares here. We will see actually a lot of positions. Oops, sorry about that. We will see actually a lot of positions where the position just resembles a Breyer system, because typically in the Breyer variation of the Lopez, this knight is on d7. Actually had to spend like a couple of tempi going from c6 to b8 to d7. And the bishop is typically on g7 here. The pawn structure is defined with the pawn on e5. The bishop is quite useful on b7 here also. And so we get a very interesting like Breyer type of position. And it's useful to know the ideas there. In this position, white can play the move a4. It's important actually to include this move first. After a6 here and e5, for your forcing line, this should actually just lead to equality after d5, d5, and at g4. Forcing this pawn to eventually advance because it's very weak here. After ab5 takes, and e6 here. After fe6, this looks like our pawn structure is very weak, but we have opened up the f file here for the rook, and we have a lot of active pieces eyeing down the white king. So after a move like h3, it's nice to play bishop takes f3, damaging the pawn structure first, and then bringing the knight to h6. After rook takes e6 and knight f5, black has a very nice and active position. The pawn structure is damaged, white has not completed queenside development, and yeah, this provides a lot of counterplay for black despite having a bad pawn structure. Yeah, white also has a bad pawn structure. Instead of including a4, they can go for e5 immediately, but after d5, knight g4, it's similar to the other line, but after e6, fe6, again, this typical pressure, possible ideas of bishop takes f3 are coming, and we have a lot of pressure. So yeah, that's quite a nice position there. Instead of playing rook e1, they can immediately go for d4, which I think is more logical. Yeah, and after cd4, so the thing is that we don't typically want to take on d4 here, but after cd4, in this situation, this does take this thing away out of the e5 advance. And knight c3, so the typical reason why we don't want to take on d4 is that this allows them to move knight c3, but in this position with b5 included, knight c3 can be met with b4. So here bishop e7, so this prevents knight c3 because b4 would just win a pawn. And so knight bd2. So now after this, we're kind of happy to see this move because they're not able to play knight c3 in an ideal world. And after castles, rook e1, this is all logical, and we're following this game by Castellanos versus MVL in the World Rapid in 2019. Now e5 is a nice improvement over that game. And the point is that after they close the center here, we can play the move a5, and this secures the c5 square for the knight, so that b4 doesn't come. Black can then play b4 and then activate the bishop to a6 on this long diagonal. And yeah, this looks just like a very nice closed Spanish position for black. So that's possible. And yeah, we will see where a lot of the times we get this kind of setup, especially in the lines with bishop d3 coming back to c2. Very typical maneuver in like the Ruy Lopez, or like bishop a4 to c2. And so this position can often transpose into a nice version of the Ruy Lopez. So yeah, that's if they play bishop c2. If they play rook e1 here, with the idea of coming back with the bishop on f1 and then playing d4, Castles, bishop f1. Black's pieces are a bit awkward, and white does achieve d4 quite quickly. And so it's nice here to actually change the structure with knight e5. The point being that if white takes an e5, and gets a structure after d3 and b6, black actually gets a lot of counterplay on the d file here, with the bishop coming to a6, queen coming to d6 to free up the d8 square for one of the rooks. Black can potentially look to occupy the f4 square with the knight, or even bring the knight to d6 there, where it would be quite nice. And it's a very double-edged move to allow this kind of structure change, because the bishop on g7 does become bad long-term. But if we have enough counterplay, especially on the d-pawn here, I do like black's chances. Especially, I've learned through experience that if white does not get this g3, f4, maybe g3, f4 is not actually particularly good, because, black can take on f4 and just like undouble the pawns and open up the bishop, actually. So it's a very double-edged decision, but I think black does get nice counterplay in this line. Instead of they play the move d4 immediately, now we can take on f3, forcing queen takes f3, and now take on d4 and play queen b6 with a lot of counterplay on d4. And this seems to be a very nice position. So that's this line with like bishop d3. The old move and the main line in this, in the c3, in the fourth move c3, is this move queen e2. Now it's important to push the bishop back first, bishop a4, and now we get a b5 with the tempo. And for bishop c2, compared with the main line of like castling immediately, the idea in that line where white played castles on the fourth move, for example, in this position, castle on the fourth move, there's a typical idea of playing a6, b5, and then, for example, a6, bishop d3, knight f6, rook e1, c3, or rather, in this line, maybe with c3, b5, a4, bishop b7, something like this. Oops. Okay, maybe if they don't play this, something like this. And there's a very typical idea here of playing the move c4, which prevents the d-pawn from advancing, and with the idea of like controlling the center, because then we can take en passant and not allow white to occupy the full center. So that's just the idea that I want to mention. And so in this line with instead of castles with c3, knight f6, queen e2, a6, bishop a4, b5, coming back here, bishop b7 and d4. In here, it's not really wise to play c4 because the queen is on e2 and putting pressure on c4 here. So after b3, white can nicely undermine this pawn on c4 without black, being in time to play a move like queen c7 and rook c8. If they can play queen c7 and rook c8, if they were like one tempo faster with like the bishop having been on b7, then this is a good position. But without being able to reinforce the pawn on a c4, this is quite a dubious position, because if we take here, then d4 can come eventually. So instead, after bishop e7, d4, they can play castle first or d4 immediately. This will transpose. Black has the option of playing a g6 or e6 setup, but I think that an e6 setup is more wise because white has accomplished c3 and d4 relatively quickly here. And so a g6 setup, is quite healthy here, but it does allow some complications after bishop g7, and then e5 immediately, or this immediate move e5. This leads to a lot of complications after bishop takes f3. And like the pawn would take back, very messy. And so I tend to stray away from those kinds of positions, and I just prefer an e6 setup because this harmoniously completes development with bishop e7 without running into e5, e6. Castles bishop e7, and white wants to play this move rook e1, knight d2, and knight f1. And so it's very important here after rook e1 that we play this move queen c7. It's a very nice move that actually prevents knight d2 because we can now capture on d4. And now this forces knight takes d4 because they cannot maintain a strong center because the bishop on c2 is hanging. So that's the important finesse. Queen c7 is a very nice move. And here bishop d3. So white is forced to make a waste of this tempo here. And if they want to play this move knight d2 and go for this typical reroute. And so after castles, knight d2, rook f8, just bracing here, supporting the center, and freeing up the f8 square for a bishop potentially. After knight f1, yeah, clarifying the tension here on with cd4 is not actually desirable. I actually questioned, like, why isn't this desirable? Because, you know, with the knight not being able to come to c3 immediately, I thought that this move is quite reasonable. But clarifying the tension makes black's pieces just worse behind their own pawns. For example, something like this would just, you know, it looks decent at first glance, but actually, yeah, black's bishops are just quite bad in this kind of position. And so I think it's important to understand that to avoid this pitfall. Instead, e5 immediately is nice to just define the pawn structure. And now this kind of resembles the Chicorin variation of the Lopez, you know, with both the e5 and c5 pawns here. And here d5 is very principled, and I will play c4, gaining the c5 square for the knight. And for bishop c2, knight c5 will be met with b4, so a5 here is a nice move. And now we get typical queenside play with a move like g6, dropping the bishop back to f8 to g7. And this just, yeah, actually resembles more like a Breyer position, or more like a, yeah, Chicorin, I think. More like a Chicorin, actually, with this pawn being on c4. And the c5 square being open for the knight. And so, yeah, this is quite a nice position, I think. I feel like. Yeah, so instead of that, rook e1, another move possible is bishop f4 here. And after queen c7, I do like this move because this possibly threatens e5. And if they push e5, then after d5, then I don't think, yeah, black has white as much, or even like knight d5, you know. Yeah, attacking the bishop, which is quite vulnerable on f4. The rook c1 here, trying to line up pressure on the c file, castles, knight bd2. Yeah, a move like knight d2 here, we need to be very aware of the situation, and we understand here that the bishop no longer can retreat to d2, and so this move e5 is quite nice to challenge the center and force the bishop to retreat either to g3 or e3, after which bishop to g3 can be met with knight h5, and bishop to e3 can be met with knight g4. So we're going to win the bishop pair one way or another, with quite a nice closed Ruy Lopez position. So yeah, that's a lot to take in, but yeah, I hope that I can convey the ideas of like all of these variations and give some practical tips. The last move is castles, which is the most natural move, I feel like, in this position, because white wants to protect the pawn with rook e1 and bishop f1. And so, seeing that they want to play rook e1 and bishop f1, black needs to play the thematic move a6 first to prevent white from playing rook e1 and then bishop f1, because now the bishop can no longer, you know, come to f1. And so white has two options here. Bishop e2 doesn't make much sense. The bishop doesn't, you know, have any long-term prospects on e2. And so the main options are bishop takes d7 or bishop retreating to d3. The main move is bishop d3, but let's look at what happens if bishop takes d7. This can actually just transpose to the main line after bishop takes d7, like d4, you know, takes, and this transposes to the main line. Something like e5, queen d3, and h6 here would transpose, I think, very quickly. Instead, they can also play c4, which enters the Maroczy bind, not the Maroczy bind. Yeah, here, c4. And here there are two options. e5 is a very legitimate setup, actually, which requires further investigation. It's very playable. Yeah, Artur Nixon's in his 2018 database for modern chess on the Moscow Sicilian says that this move is quite dubious. But yeah, he's using, like, you know, 2018 engines, and they haven't figured out the objective, you know, the best way to play. And the reason that this move is playable is actually because, first off, c3 and d4 cannot be played to undermine the center. And black has the bishop on d7 already prepared to create some quick queenside counterplay with b5. So black will play b5 like very soon. And additionally, knight e7 to g6 will come to defend the center, and black will play, you know, bishop e7, castles, and then play for f5, and going for quite an aggressive setup. Now the main line, yeah, recommended by Artur Nixon's is knight c3, and after the move b5, d3, knight e7, a3 here, preparing b4 to create counterplay, knight g6, b4, black will just ignore it with bishop e7, and then after knight d5, castles, rook e1 and rook c8. Yeah, black should get good counterplay here with h6 to cover the g5 square, and then f5 next. And I think, yeah, it's a very reasonable position to have. And it's nice that the knight is on g6 here because it defends the e5 pawn, so that if takes, our e5 pawn is defended nicely. And so yeah, this is an equal position, but it requires further investigation. Instead, knight f6 has been the main move. Very logical. It's just a classical way to play, just allowing the Maroczy bind. Knight c3, and now g6. You know, white can play d4 immediately, or try to go for complications here. This move is a novelty, and it changes the pawn structure dramatically. But if black plays accurately, they shouldn't get into any trouble. Though it's important to see, like, you know, this looks like a reasonable move. After takes, the queen is coming to f3, possibly to pressure the queen side. And so after bishop g7, queen f3, queen c7 is an important move here, attacking the knight and defending b7. If they take on d7 here, then this releases the tension, and after a move like d3 in castles, simply black has no problems. You know, they can look for counterplay here or just play on the d file, pressuring the d pawn. Instead of that, rook e1 is possible, maintaining the tension, and this is the most challenging move. After bishop e6, getting the bishop out of any threats, d3, and now there is a threat of knight bishop f4 immediately. And so black should play this move knight d7, challenging the knight on e5. And after knight d7, queen d7, knight e4. And yeah, the potential is that the knight is first off attacking the c5 pawn, and it can actually come to g5. And so after rook c8, bishop e3, forcing b6 here, white can play this move knight g5, and it's not comfortable to deal with this move actually. But the thing is that we need to know that after we castled, white can damage the pawn structure, but black will get a long-term bishop on this diagonal, very strong, and the open f file to work with. For example, knight e6, fe6, queen e2, trying to put latent pressure on e6, and now rook c6. And after this move, black will actually get a lot of counterplay against the d pawn with rook d6 coming. And so black has very good pressure. I quite like this position for black. So yeah, just don't be afraid of this knight g5 move. It is a novelty though, so it might catch someone off guard. Instead d4 here, just entering the Maroczy bind. But there is a different set of circumstances here because the knight on d7 was traded for the left-sword bishop, which I think should favor black because we do get the bishop pair first off, and we exchange it for a knight. So the knight which was on d7, so this is quite a nice exchange. After cd4, knight takes d4, bishop g7. If they play a move like b3 here, this allows black to suddenly break the position with b5. cb5, ab5, and taking on b5 would run into knight takes e4 due to the weak diagonal. And so bishop g5 here is possible. And for castles, queen d3, black can get queen b6 here, and I think black has a lot of counterplay, having achieved b5 and potential of playing b4 here. So that's sufficient. Instead, queen d3 is also possible, defending c4 and controlling the b5 square to prevent b5. And so here, knight g4. So white is not in time to play the move h3 and the bishop e3, which would be the ideal setup, because black has this move knight g4 to prepare knight e5 and put pressure on c4. So now knight f3. This is the only logical move to cover the e5 square. And there are two interesting options here. b5 was, it's very possible to play in a Benko gambit style, but this is a very long-term pawn sacrifice, and so I don't really recommend this for humans, maybe in correspondence play, but yeah, the position can get kind of interesting here. It looks just like a very interesting Benko gambit, but white does have like the two pass pawns on the queen side, and so I wouldn't be entirely comfortable in this kind of position, though you might be, so I just want to mention that option. And so castles here is more logical. If they kick the knight with h3, this attempts to misplace the black bishop after we play knight e5, takes, and yeah, white wants to claim that this bishop on e5 is misplaced, and after a4, trying to prevent b5, rook c8, and there's a threat of bishop e6 if white does nothing. So bishop g5 and knight d5 is an interesting combination to try to put pressure on e7, and so here rook e8 is quite nice, defending e7 prophylactically. And now rook ac1 would sacrifice the a4 pawn after bishop takes e3 and bishop takes a4. this looks, you know, kind of risky because we weaken the dark squares, but this just concretely works after bishop h4, bishop h6, bishop c6. This targets e4, and queen d4 threatens mate, but we can simply block the whole diagonal e5. And actually, there are ideas of queen h4 here, attacking both e4 and the bishop. And so, if they play queen d3, immediately queen h4 just wins. And instead, after queen e3, again queen h4 targets e4. And if they play a move like f3, f6 here followed by g5 just traps the bishop. So this is just a very nice position. Instead, if they play b3, now we can make use of the weakened long diagonal and play b5. And we get good counterplay. So yeah, we can see that in a lot of these positions, it seems like b5 is not possible, but we need to be very aware of the situation, and b5 here is possible because of the weak diagonal. And it's only in this position now can we play it. If we are one move too slow, white can play rook c1 and prevent b5 forever. So we need to be very time aware. Instead, knight d5 is possible, which gets messy after we take on b2. But this forcing line should be okay. Bishop f6. If they take on f6 with the knight, then this would give black a tempo here. Bishop h6 and queen c7. Everything is weak and hanging. We also have a weak structure, but white also has a very weak pawn structure as well. Instead, if they play bishop takes f6, which is the best move, and e takes f6, they can play knight b6 here, but after rook b8, queen d6, and bishop c6, black is for choice because of all the weak pawns. And instead of rook takes b7, it's important here to see that what is threatening. They're threatening to take the bishop here and then fork us on f6. So bishop c6 here, and after rook a7, rook a8, just trading off the active rook, takes. After rook b1, and now we remove the strong knight on d5. And yeah, this position looks quite dangerous actually after queen takes d5, right? But actually, yeah, we do have a weak structure, but we get a lot of counterplay against white's pawns as well. So not only is our structure weak, but white's structure is also quite weak. So after rook e5 here, queen c6, king g7, stepping out of the last rank. If they try to secure the center with f3 here, after a5, this is quite fine for black because it looks like white can play rook d1 here and target d6. But if they do, we can play the nice move queen b8 and prepare infiltration on b3, or if queen takes d6. Or if they play rook takes d6, then we can infiltrate on the back rank with actually some very dangerous initiative. And so if they play rook b7 here, activating the rook, now a5 again, safeguarding the pawn, rook d7, queen b8. And again, we have pressure on the last rank. And also e4 is weak. So for example, here we could just get on e4, and this is a fine position. Instead of rook takes d6, now we can check, and then again take on e4, rook takes f6, and now queen c2. Now winning back c4 with an equal position. For example, rook f3, queen c4, just holds everything together. So yeah. After queen takes d5, this is fine. If cd5, saying that, I'm trying to get this nice structure and fix the weakness on d6 without putting all of my pawns, under threat, a5 here is nice. And black wants to play queen c7 to take over the c file. And so I think best here is for white to prevent that with queen c4. It's a little bit annoying, but after this move rook e7, very important. Black prepares rook c7 to challenge the c file, and black has a good position. The king can step up, and yeah, both sides have equally weak structures. So I think this is quite a fine position for black. Yeah. And so h3 is possible here, but after castles, a4 is also possible, trying to stop b5. But now we can actually play b5 immediately. A very nice break here, because if black achieves b5 here without losing a pawn, they're generally doing quite well. And in this structure, and in this position, after ab5, rook a8, queen a8, there's actually no convenient way to take on b5, because taking here would just allow this, and the b5 pawn is not surviving long term. And after cb5, bishop takes c3, very important decision. And bc3, queen a3, queen a4 here just wins back the pawn with a nice position, because c4 runs into bishop e6, losing the pawn again. And queen d4 here, which was played by Grisham against Shanklin, trying to trade off the queens. runs to bishop takes b5, and this is clearly equal, you know, equal position. C pawn may be weak, so I do like this position for black. So yeah, it's important to pay attention to when b5 is possible when it seems like it isn't. So that covers this move c4. Okay, so the last variation here after this decision to take on d7 and bishop takes d7 is this move c3. And now, yeah, this prepares a simple idea of playing d4. And after knight f6, rook e1, black has a couple of ways to play. Bishop c6 is interesting, and it gets crazy. So I do recommend, you know, if you like the crazy lines, go look into this. Bishop g5, you know, this gets to a very interesting gambit, which I don't know what's happening, honestly. Black is really lagging in development, but they are up 2 pawns, and so yeah, it's really unclear. Requires further investigation, and instead I like this classical move e6. So after d4, it's possible here, you know, the classical way to play is just to take on d4, play d5, and then stick the knight on e4 with supposedly an equal position. But I do like, you know, just not entering this very, you know, big tabia, which has been played like, you know, hundreds or thousands of times, and instead just playing bishop e7, saying that, you know, e5 is not really desirable. You don't really want to overextend your pawns. And yeah, for example, yeah, otherwise we would just get like bishop e, you know, castles, queen c7, rook c8, b5, and we can potentially look to close out the position and just get an interesting like position resembling the closed Ruy Lopez. And instead, if they play e5 now after de5, de5, knight d5, this enters a very interesting complications actually, which is why I want to mention this line. After c4, there are a couple of options here. The main move has been knight b4, but I actually prefer the move knight b6 after looking at this. After knight b4, the threat is to play bishop c6 here to make use of the knight's position to possibly trade the queens and play knight c2, right, to trap the rook. And so white should play a3 here. And after knight c6, knight c3, the reason that I don't particularly like this position is because the knight can possibly come to e4. And according to the computer here, best is to play knight a5, or after castles play knight a5. It can really just transpose. And after knight e4, bishop c6, queen c2, defending the pawn. H6 here is important to prevent knight eg5, because castles could have been met with knight eg5. After g6 and h4, white has the initiative. So it's important to play h6 here. And after bishop d2, castles, b4, takes on e4. Our knight is trapped, so we need to take on e4 here so that we free up the c6 square. Knight c6, bc5, something like this. Queen d7 is the best move. But here we're actually kind of just getting attacked. And yeah, I mean, objectively it should be equal with like a possible repetition, but I don't really want to, you know, allow this kind of position. So actually this move knight b6 is very nice. And so we saw that in that variation. The reason I wanted to show it is that the queen often lands on c2 there, which is quite annoying because it puts pressure on this diagonal and defends the c4 pawn. But with knight b6, the best move here is to play queen e2. And so white doesn't have this long-term pressure on this diagonal anymore, and they can't create threats with, you know, knight g5 coming anytime soon. And so I like provoking this. If they play queen c2 immediately, this defends c4 and takes control of the long diagonal. But the problem is that once bishop c6 is played, there's a constant threat of bishop takes f3, which the queen on e2 would have been, you know, nice to parry the threat of bishop takes f3. And so here bishop c6, threatening bishop takes f3, and so knight d2 has to be played, preparing knight e4 and defending the knight. Knight c3 also notably can't be played because besides taking on f3, c4 would also fall. So after knight bd2, h6 here, preventing any knight g5 jumps, knight e4, knight d7, putting some pressure on e5. And more importantly, it also has ideas of bringing the knight to g6 to defend the king side and put also, you know, some pressure on e5 while being more secure. After bishop f4 and castles, white can try to play, you know, queen c1, a silent draw offer, saying that if you play king h7, queen c2, I'll just repeat here, you know. But if black wants to avoid the repetition, they can play rook e8. and the, sacrifice doesn't really work because we can just quickly consolidate with bishop f8 to g7. And so here the idea is simply to play queen c7, bring the knight to f8 to g6, and then eventually possibly, undermine the c4 pawn with b5. And this is a very healthy position with allowing pressure because the bishop on c6 is such a strong piece, and there's a constant threat of like bishop takes f3 if this knight moves. So that's quite a nice position if they play queen c2. And if they play queen e2, this defends c4 and the knight on f3. And after bishop c6 and knight c3, now queen c7, stepping out of the d file, very typical move, knight e4, and now castles. Now we can omit h6 here because the queen is no longer on c2, and so there's no knight g5 moves. And so that's the idea. But still, white can try to generate an attack with h4. This is one of the top lines of the engine. And now h6. Only now that they've played h4, do we play h6 because we want to prevent a possible piece from coming there. And also this pawn can be vulnerable at sometimes. So after bishop f4 here, most natural square for the bishop, rook a d8, we can see that an additional benefit of having this knight on b6 is that if they play the move knight d6, we have this timely move knight c8. And so if the knight is forced to retreat, we clearly have a nice, a decent, a good game. And if they try to reinforce the knight here, we can simply try to double up on the d file with good pressure. So that's good. If they play rook ad1, which looks natural, but it trades pieces, which exemplifies the overextension of both the e5 and h4 pawns. And so we just want to trade pieces here, rook d1, rook d8, and in the endgame we would be quite comfortable. After knight d6, again knight c8. And now we have, even though we don't have the two rooks, we can look for queen rook d7 and bring the queen back to d8 to put pressure on the d file. And additionally, we can also consider playing b5, and black is just fourth choice here. And again, if rook ac1, developing and defending c4, now bishop takes e4, taking the opportunity to remove the knight on e4, so that because we want to be able to meet knight d6 with knight c8, but the knight is kind of stuck on b6 if we don't play if we allow the knight on to stay on e4. And so now we take the knight on e4, and then we bring the knight to c6 via b8 with quite a nice position here. Black is perfectly fine and can try to enter an endgame with trading more pieces and argue that white's pawns on e5 and h4 are overextended. So that's an equal position, and this is the reason why I like this move knight b6 a lot. Many ideas, discouraging queen z2, and also possibly seeing a long turn that if the knight comes to d6, we can retreat with knight c8. So a very nice move. Yeah, but it has not been played, I believe. So yeah, that's bishop takes d7. Instead, we're going to be looking at this move bishop d3, which is the main point of this entire system with castles on the fourth move. Again, they want to play c3 and bishop c2. And so we play knight gf6 here. Very logical. And they can play c3 here, preparing bishop c2 and d4 immediately. So we'll look at that. And now black has a couple of options here. Black can play the most challenging and the main line, theoretically, which is b5. It becomes very complicated, but I want to show that the ideas behind this variation. I think that black's fighting chances here are the greatest, and so this does become a memory contest in the most forcing lines. An interesting idea here is to undermine the pawns with a4, and it's important to play bishop e7. Typical idea, if we trade the rooks on a8, the queen comes to a8 to pressure e4. So for example here, this position is completely fine. But it does allow this move d4, a very interesting piece sacrifice on b1 because the black king has not castled. And for example, I just want to show the direction here. Bishop e1, dc5, bishop e4. Black is fine here, but needs to know some complications after rook e1 or the move c takes d6. So, and it's, at least equality. So it's a memory contest there, which, if I'm playing blitz, I don't really want to do that. So yeah, instead of playing this move b5, e6 is kind of the traditional, a very traditional way to play. And now if white plays a4, preventing b5, we also need to look at this. We can also go for, just b6 and then bishop b7. But it's a close position here with, a4 and b6 included. Might not be the preference of some players, although this is completely fine, typical moves like queen c7, rook fe8, bishop f8, rook ac8, and, you know, probably closing the center with e5 is a reasonable idea. It's very healthy. But instead, this move d5 is actually very nice. And now this is an unusual move. We don't see often, but in this specific position, it's very nice. Seeing that, you know, they've wasted kind of some time with a4, we can strike in the center immediately. Now, the point is that if they play e5, the pawn becomes very weak. After knight g4, rook e1, queen c7, queen e2, we have this move c4. After bishop c2, this free ups the c5 square for the bishop, and so f2 is being threatened, and so e5 will also be won next because rook f1 is forced. So yeah, that's the reason that e5 cannot be played. Instead, after e takes d5 and knight takes d5, yeah, this opens up. Yeah, first off, this construction with the bishop behind the pawn on d2 here is quite unusual. After rook e1, bishop e7, a5 here. This tries to create a bind on the queen side here, on the queen side pawns. But again, we have this typical, typical move we saw in the variation before. After b5, ab6, and bishop e7, again delaying the recaptures. And now black has a very active position here with the diagonal open, and white not having achieved d4. So ideas of like castles, knight takes b6, bishop f6, queen c7, things like that. Black has a very active position. So this d5 move is very nice. And instead of they play bishop c2, very logical to prepare d4, now b5. So typically if we play b5 with the bishop on d3, we run into some a4, you know, with a lot of pressure on b5. But now that the bishop is no longer on d3, we can play b5 here and prepare bishop e7 next. Now a4 can be met here with bishop e7, and again, taking on b5 would allow, you know, the queen to recapture on a8. So that's fine. And a lot of pressure on e4. So rook e1, bishop e7, and this just looks like the variation with the 8th move d4. So without the moves a4 and a4 included here, but it just creates some additional tension, which needs to be calculated more thoroughly because of the tension. But it's fine for black. It's completely fine. d4 here is the more classical way to play. After bishop e7, rook e1, bishop e7, knight bd2, and queen c7. Again, we control the e5 square with harmonious development, and this will soon resemble a closed Lopez. After knight f1, just improving the knight to g3, castles, knight g3, rook fe8, bracing for possible e5 advances. And after a move like h3, we see this game by Ho Yifan versus played between Ho Yifan and MVL in 2014. And in this position, after bishop f8, typical Breyer move actually, bishop d3 and e5. This just looks like a Breyer, a variation of the Maroczy Lopez, which I'll just bring up like right after this. After d5, c4 here, for example, bishop e2 and a5. This is a typical Breyer. You know, we get on bishop g6 and bishop g7. We want to play bishop a6, bring the rook to b8, and gain counterplay on the queen side here with a possible b4 advance. So very nice position, and yeah, it's just important to know like the typical ideas of counterplay, and this becomes a very long-term, positional game, which black should be happy to enter. So yeah, we're gonna be looking at just a comparison with the Breyer actually. If we can look at the Maroczy Lopez here, bishop e5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castle, c3, d6, d4, d4 runs into bishop g4, so h3 is important first, and then knight b8, d4, bishop, knight bd7, knight bd2, bishop b7, bishop c2, important to defend this pawn, rook e8, knight f1. I believe Breyer theory continues something like this, bishop f8, knight knight here, there. And now if they play d5 here, this doesn't really, it does like really resemble the position we saw in here, but we see that white having not played d5 means that if d5 is played now, we can play c6, very typical idea. But yeah, variations can branch out from here, like a4, I believe c5 or something like that, and we can get a very similar position as in this. And we just in general, we can see that the structure is very similar, and so we can apply ideas or themes in the Breyer to this, or just in the closed Ruy Lopez into this position. So yeah, it just keeps a lot of pieces on the board and is a very equal but long-term strategic game. So that is the main line with castles. This is me from the future, reviewing the footage that I recorded. I kind of forgot that to mention some of the alternatives. After castles here, an a6, bishop d3, knight f6, rook e1, e6, c3 here. There's this move b5. And yeah, the most forcing line is after a4 here. Yeah, bishop e7, bishop c2, something like this. There's a very typical idea that I just want to show, which is this move c4. And yeah, it becomes quite forcing here in this specific variation, which is why I kind of wanted to avoid recommending it. Because a move like d4 here is the main line, cd3, queen d3, and black gets, you know, the pawn here on e4, but after bishop e3 and bishop d4, position becomes very imbalanced in the sense that black is lacking in development and can't exactly castle so quickly. So I kind of wanted to avoid this recommendation. So yeah, but it's still completely playable, and you know, if that's your cup of tea, you should definitely go analyze it. Yeah, and instead, let's see, this typical idea, yeah, b5, a4 here, bishop e7, bishop c2, c4 is very typical, a b5, takes, yeah, this is also very typical idea. Yeah, but the general threat, I believe, is in this line after c3, b5 here, and the main line is bishop c2, and then bishop e7, rook e1, c4, and then a4 here. Yeah, this is the line that I kind of wanted to avoid. There is this move, takes, and then knight a3, and this is kind of like, yeah, this specific line is kind of what I wanted to avoid, because this gets some mass exchanges according to theory, which is fine, but you know, queen b, is it d3 or queen b7? Maybe d3 first. cd3 and knight b5, queen b7, and yeah, queen takes d3, and the position gets very wild and, you know, imbalance here. Position is fine objectively, but you know, if we could apply principles of like just the closed Ruy Lopez, which is very strategic in nature and kind of my style personally, at least, that's kind of why why I'm steering more towards yeah, the more like close Ruy Lopez type of positions, is because I'm more of a positional player. So yeah, maybe that's my bias, but yeah, these positions are often very tactical. If black decides to play this move b5, yeah, this early move b5, and then plays c4, yeah, but it does, you know, theoretically hold up. So I do recommend looking into Onishigiri's course if you want to examine more of those lines and more of the forcing lines that grandmasters have played for a long time. So yeah, that was a lot of theory, but I hope that it could improve your understanding, and I tried my best here to provide some, you know, generally useful tips, and what I found in practice. So for example, when to play g6 and when to play e6, you know, typical ideas in the Maroczy bind, and especially this idea with, like, you know, if white clamps down on the queen side with a4, a5, this typical idea of playing b5 and after a b6, playing bishop b7 instead of immediately recapturing to keep some of the options open. Those kind of ideas I hope are particularly useful to you. Yeah, if you want to play this in slower time controls or in blitz. And yeah, in the next video we're going to be looking at the fourth move d4, which leads to completely different types of play with the queen being centralized on d4. So yeah, that's going to be it from me in this video. If you have any suggestions, criticisms, you know, suggestions for future videos, criticisms for some lines or some things you don't agree with, I'm more than happy to discuss those in the comments. Yeah, we had an interesting discussion when we talked about the bishop d7 line in the previous video. Someone did disagree with my conclusions, and that's completely fine. You know, it depends on your evaluation of the position. There is no necessarily right or wrong conclusion. So yeah, I'm very interested to see what you think. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.